There is a specific kind of silence that settles over a missing persons case after the first year passes. The press conferences thin out. The search parties disband. The flyers on telephone poles start to fade, then curl at the edges, then disappear entirely. The detectives assigned to the case still have it in a file. They still turn to it on quiet nights, still review it when a new tip comes in, still carry the face of the missing person in some corner of their professional memory. But the world, as it always does, moves on, and the families are left in the cruelest possible place, a state of not knowing that has no name. Not grief, because grief requires certainty. Not hope, because hope that refuses to acknowledge the years is its own form of torment. Just waiting. Just the daily exercise of getting up and continuing to exist in a world that no longer holds your missing person visible, while refusing to accept that they are gone. Then imagine a phone rings, or a campus officer runs a background check on a stranger, or a woman sees a crack in the door and decides that today, after years of waiting, today is the day she runs. And somewhere in a house that looks exactly like every other house on the street, in a backyard that looks exactly like every other backyard in the neighborhood, in a room that the rest of the world drove past every single day for a decade without knowing what was inside it, someone is still alive. This is a story of what it looks like when cops find people who were abducted years ago, what it costs to survive that long, what it takes to get them out, and what happens to the people who are finally, impossibly, found. Story 1. The House on Seymour Avenue. It was a warm afternoon in the spring of 2013 on Seymour Avenue in Cleveland, Ohio. Charles Ramsey had just sat down to eat a meal inside his house when he heard something from next door that stopped him cold. Not a loud crash, not something obviously dangerous, just a woman's voice coming through the wall, screaming for help. He went outside. What he found was a young woman he had never seen before, pressed against the interior door of the house next door, trying to force it open through a gap she had created at the bottom. She was screaming. There was a little girl with her. Ramsey and another neighbor, Angel Cordero, came to the door and began kicking at it. The bottom portion gave way. The woman and the child crawled out through the opening onto the porch. The woman's name was Amanda Berry. She was 27 years old. She had last been seen as a 16-year-old girl walking home from her shift at a Burger King on the night before her 17th birthday, 10 years and 15 days earlier. She ran across the street to another neighbor's house and grabbed a phone. The 911 call she made in those next few minutes is one of the most recognized recordings in American true crime history. Help me, I'm Amanda Berry. I've been kidnapped and I've been missing for 10 years. And I'm here. I'm free now. The dispatcher, trying to process what she was hearing, asked Berry to repeat herself. And Amanda Berry, who had been inside that house since she was 16 years old, who had given birth to a daughter inside those walls, who had survived a decade of unimaginable cruelty, said it again. I've been missing for 10 years. I'm here. I'm free now. The man nobody suspected. Ariel Castro was 52 years old when Amanda Berry escaped from his home on Seymour Avenue. He had lived in that neighborhood for years. He drove a school bus. He attended neighborhood cookouts. He was known to his neighbors as an ordinary, slightly eccentric man who kept mostly to himself. Nobody had cause to look twice at him. Nobody had reason to. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was not remarkable. It was a 2-story white home on a residential street in the city's Tremor neighborhood. Castro had bought it in 1992, initially living there with his wife and their children. When the relationship ended and his family left, he was alone in the house. And in August 2002, he began bringing people into it who would never be allowed to leave. Michelle Knight was 21 years old when she disappeared from Lorraine Avenue in Cleveland. Police, who knew that Knight had been going through a difficult period. She had recently lost custody of her young son and had been struggling, largely assumed she had left voluntarily. She was an adult. There was no Amber Alert. She received, as investigators later acknowledged, very limited attention. She was not widely known as a missing person. For 11 years, the world did not look for Michelle Knight with anything close to adequate urgency. Amanda Berry disappeared on April 21, 2003, the evening before her 17th birthday. She had called her sister from work to say she was getting a ride home. That was the last anyone heard from her. Her mother, Luana Miller, spent years fighting to keep Amanda's case visible. She appeared on television. She spoke to media. She refused to let her daughter be forgotten. In 2006, Luana Miller died of heart failure. She never knew what happened to her daughter. She never knew that Amanda was alive 2 miles from where she had disappeared. Gina DeJesus was 14 years old on April 2nd, 2004, when she vanished on her walk home from school. She had stopped at a payphone with a friend, called home to ask if she could sleep over, being told no, and turned to walk home. She never arrived. Investigators initially weren't certain whether her disappearance was connected to Amanda Berry's, though both girls had vanished within blocks of each other. One of the people interviewed on the television program America's Most Wanted about Gina's disappearance was a girl named Arlene Castro, Ariel Castro's own daughter, who had been Gina's close friend. For nearly a decade, Castro attended vigils for Gina DeJesus. He sat in rooms with her grieving family. He expressed sympathy. He maintained the face of a neighbor who cared about a missing girl, while a captor lived inside his chest. What was inside the house? In the months and years that followed the rescue, the full picture of what had happened inside 2207, Seymour Avenue came out in testimony, investigative reports, and the accounts of women themselves gave to investigators and eventually to the public. Castro had kept the women restrained in the basement initially, then in individual rooms upstairs. The rooms were barricaded from the outside. Every door that led to freedom had been reinforced, chained, or wired shut. Each room where the women were held had a small hole cut into the wall through which Castro would push food. Chains were kept in closets. Castro controlled when they ate, when they slept, when they could move. He tested them. If he suspected they were planning to escape, he would leave a door partially unlocked to see if they would try to run. If they did, they were beaten. Michelle Knight described living under the constant weight of that kind of surveillance, never knowing which moments of apparent freedom were real and which were traps. Amanda Berry's daughter Jocelyn was born in captivity. Knight was the one who delivered her, doing so under conditions that defied description, under threat from Castro that if the baby died she would pay for it with her life. Jocelyn grew up inside that house knowing no other world. She was 6 years old on the day her mother escaped. The parole system had failed in ways that cut deep. Castro had been convicted of domestic violence against his ex-wife. Authorities later acknowledged multiple errors and missed opportunities that, had they been caught, should have raised serious questions about what was happening at that address years before the rescue. On the morning of May 6, 2013, Castro left the house and forgot to lock the large inside door. It was the first time in the years Amanda Berry had been held there that the door between her room and the main floor was left unsecured. She didn't know if it was another test. She stood at the edge of that decision for a moment. Then she went. The officers who walked through the door. When Cleveland police officers Anthony Espada and Michael Tracy received a radio call that morning, the dispatcher's report was almost impossible to process. A woman had called and identifying herself as Amanda Berry. The Amanda Berry, the one who had been missing since 2003. They drove to Seymour Avenue. They entered the house, and what they found upstairs, the barricaded rooms, the chains in the closets, the holes in the walls, the mattresses on the floors of locked rooms, told them everything about what had been happening inside this ordinary-looking house on an ordinary-looking street for the past decade. Michelle Knight heard the officers in the hallway and stuck her head out of her room. She saw a badge. She ran toward it. She was so small after years of captivity and controlled feeding that Officer Spada thought she was a child. She jumped into his arms. "Never let me go," she told him. Gina DeJesus, hearing what was happening, came out of her room. She told investigators afterward that she wasn't sure the officers were real. She thought they might be people in costumes. The concept of rescue had been waiting in her mind for 9 years without arriving, and now that it was here, her brain couldn't fully accept it. On the police radio, Officers Espada and Tracy transmitted 4 words that became one of the most replayed moments of that entire day. "We found them. We found them." Ariel Castro was arrested that same afternoon. He was out drinking when Amanda Berry escaped. He came home to police. He was charged with 937 criminal counts, including kidnapping and rape. He pleaded guilty in July 2013 to avoid the death penalty and was sentenced to life in prison plus 1,000 years. On September 3, 2013, exactly 1 month into his sentence, he was found dead in his cell. He had taken his own life. The house at 2207 Seymour Avenue was demolished on August 7, 2013. Michelle Knight was present. She handed out yellow balloons to the crowd, which he said represented missing children everywhere. Before the demolition began, the balloons were released into the sky. Where the house once stood, there is now a garden. Here is what I want you to think about and comment on. Neighbors later reported calling police about suspicious activity at the Castro house years before the rescue. A naked woman seen in the backyard. A child seen in an attic window. Those calls were apparently not followed up on adequately. How much responsibility do you think communities carry in cases like this, when the signs are there but nobody acts? Drop your answer below. Story 2. The backyard they never checked. On June 10, 1991, an 11-year-old girl named Jaycee Dugard walked out of her house in Mayers, California, a rural community near South Lake Tahoe, to catch the school bus. She was in the 5th grade. She was looking forward to a class field trip. Her stepfather, Carl Probin, was riding his bicycle nearby when he saw a gray car slow to a stop beside her. A woman got out of the passenger side and pulled Jaycee into the car. By the time Probin reached the street, the car was already disappearing down the road. He had seen what happened. He could describe the vehicle. He called police within minutes. And Jaycee Dugard was gone for 18 years. The couple in the car were Philip Garrido, a 40-year-old convicted sex offender currently on federal parole for a previous kidnapping and rape, and his wife Nancy. Philip had used a stun gun to render Jaycee unconscious before Nancy dragged her into backseat and covered her with a blanket. The only thing Jaycee managed to hold onto during the 3-hour drive to Garrido's property in Ange, 120 miles from where she'd been taken, was a small butterfly-shaped ring. She hid it from them for the next 18 years. When investigators swarmed South Lake Tahoe in the days after the abduction, they had witnesses, a physical description of the car, and a community that was genuinely shattered by what had happened. Thousands of tips came in. FBI resources were deployed. Searches covered the region. But the investigation never extended to the Bay Area. It never reached Ange. It never reached the property on Walnut Avenue where Philip Garrido, a man on federal parole for kidnapping, had just brought an abducted 11-year-old girl and hidden her behind a fence in his backyard. The world she was forced to build. What Jaycee Dugard experienced in that backyard is documented in her own words, in her memoir A Stolen Life, and in the testimony she later gave during legal proceedings against her captors. She describes it with directness that is more devastating for its plainness. She was kept in a hidden compound built into the rear of the Garrido property. Over the years, the compound expanded into a series of sheds, tents, storage units, and a soundproof structure Garrido used as a recording studio. The entire backyard area was constructed to prevent visibility from the street and from neighbors. The fencing, the positioning of structures, the dense landscaping, all of it served to create a hidden world inside the larger world. Jaycee was given a new name. She chose Alyssa. She was told that if she tried to leave, she would be found by the Doberman pinchers Garrido claimed patrol the outer perimeter. She was told she had nowhere to go. She had been taken at 11 years old, in the 5th grade, from a small community she had never left. She had no money, no identification, no knowledge of how to navigate a world she had barely begun to understand before it was taken from her. At 14 years old, Jaycee gave birth to her first daughter, fathered by Philip Garrido. At 17, she gave birth to a second daughter. The Garridos told the children to call Nancy Mom and refer to Jaycee as an older sister. For years, her own children did not know she was their mother. Jaycee taught them everything she could with a 5th grade education. That was all she had managed to acquire before the day on the bus stop. The parole system, meanwhile, was checking in regularly. Philip Garrido's parole officer visited the Walnut Avenue property 60 times over the years. 60 visits to the home of a convicted sex offender who had previously kidnapped and raped a woman. And in 60 visits, not one parole officer pushed past the fence into the hidden rear section of the property. Not one of them found the compound. Not one of them found Jaycee, or her daughters, or any indication that something catastrophically wrong was happening behind that fence. I look back now and notice how the secret backyard didn't really look so secret, Jaycee later wrote. It makes me believe no one cared or was even really looking for me. The campus officer who noticed. On August 24, 2009, 18 years, 2 months, and 14 days after she was taken, Philip Garrido arrived at the University of California, Berkeley campus with 2 adolescent girls in tow. He wanted to inquire about obtaining a permit to host a religious event at the school. His organization was called God's Desire. He was known for erratic religious behavior, for telling people he heard the voice of God, for breaking into song in the middle of conversations. A UC Berkeley campus officer noticed him. Something about the man, the girls, the whole presentation was off. The officer ran a background check on Garrido. It came back immediately. Philip Craig Garrido, registered sex offender, federal parolee, convicted of kidnapping and rape. The officer contacted Garrido's parole officer, Edward Santos, and reported her concerns. Santos was troubled by one specific detail. He had been checking in on Garrido for years. He knew Garrido had a wife. He had never, in any of those years, known Garrido to have children. Who were these two girls? Santos ordered Garrido to bring the girls to a parole office in Concord the following day. On August 26, Garrido arrived at the parole office. With him were Nancy Garrido, the two daughters, now 50 and 11 years old, and a third young woman he introduced as Alyssa. Investigators questioned each of them separately. Alyssa told them that she was fine, that Garrido had turned his life around, that despite his history, he was a changed man. She stuck to the story of her alias. She had been using that name for 18 years, and she wasn't going to stop now in a government office with this man still in the building. Then investigators pressed Garrido himself. And in that room, with the walls closing in around a story that no longer held together, Philip Garrido broke. He admitted he had kidnapped a girl when she was 11 years old. He admitted what he had done to her. He admitted that Alyssa was that girl. He had kept Jaycee Dugard in his backyard for 18 years, 3 months, and 16 days. Jaycee sat quietly in that parole office for a long moment after Garrido's confession. Then she wrote something on a piece of paper and slid it across the table to investigators. Her real name. The officers who were present described the moment as something that stopped everyone in the room. This woman, who had grown up inside a backyard compound, who had given birth twice in captivity, who had been called Alyssa for nearly 2 decades, had just reclaimed the name she had been given at birth. She was Jaycee Lee Dugard. She was 29 years old. She was free. What came after? Philip Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. Nancy Garrido was sentenced to 36 years to life. Neither will see the outside of a prison before they die. California paid Jaycee a victim compensation settlement of $20 million, acknowledging the catastrophic failures of the parole system that had allowed Garrido to operate for 18 years without detection. Jaycee Dugard has since written 2 books and established the Jaycee Foundation, which provides support to families affected by abduction. She has spoken publicly about her experience with measured, extraordinary precision. She has raised her daughters, who are now adults. She has, by any measure, built a life that no one had the right to expect after what was done to her. In one interview, she was asked whether she ever felt she had Stockholm Syndrome, the psychological phenomenon in which captives develop emotional attachments to their captors. She rejected the characterization firmly. She said the reason she never tried to escape was not attachment but love. Love for her daughters. I couldn't leave. I had the girls. A mother's reasoning, in the middle of an 18-year nightmare. Here's the question I need you to answer in the comments. Philip Garrido's parole officer visited his home 60 times without finding Jaycee. 60. What do you think needs to fundamentally change about how parole supervision is conducted for individuals with histories of violent offenses against children? What should have happened differently? Story 3. The cold case that refused to go cold. Not every long-term abduction case ends with a dramatic escape. Some of them end with a detective who refuses to let a file gather dust, who picks up a case years after everyone else has moved on and decides that this family deserves an answer. In 1999, a 23-month-old girl named Andrea Michelle Reyes was taken from New Haven, Connecticut, by her biological mother, Rosa Tenorio. Andrea's father had legal sole custody of her at the time of the abduction. He reported her missing immediately. The investigation identified Rosa Tenorio as responsible. But by the time authorities were able to move, Rosa had already disappeared across the border into Mexico, taking Andrea with her. Andrea was 23 months old, a toddler, a child who had not yet begun to form the kind of memories that might later tell her who she was or where she had come from. The New Haven Police Department pursued the case, but the international dimension made progress extraordinarily difficult. Rosa had taken Andrea to Mexico, a country of more than 130 million people, and had no apparent intention of ever surfacing again. Andrea's father went to Mexico himself multiple times, searching for his daughter through cities and towns with no leads and no help. Years passed. Andrea's case stayed open, but the trail had long gone cold. Then, in 2023, the New Haven Police Department reopened the case file and assigned Detective Keelan Nivikoff to it. The modern tools that changed everything. What Detective Nivikoff had in 2023 that investigators in 1999 did not was a toolkit that had genuinely changed what was possible in cold case investigations. DNA technology had advanced. Social media existed. International coordination between law enforcement agencies had improved significantly, and there were new genealogical databases and digital investigative techniques that could find people who had been off the grid for decades. Nivikoff began methodically. She worked through what was known about Rosa Tenorio's likely network in Mexico, the region she had connections to, the patterns that typically emerge in parental abduction cases that cross international lines. She used a combination of interviews, search warrants, and social media investigation that the original case investigators in 1999 never had access to. The trail led to Puebla, Mexico, a city of over 1 million people, where Andrea had been living without any apparent awareness of her real identity. She had grown up as a Mexican woman, without knowing that in New Haven, Connecticut, there was a father who had spent 25 years searching for her, who had never stopped filing reports, never stopped pushing, never stopped holding on to the possibility that his daughter was somewhere in the world and still alive. Detective Nivikoff located Andrea in early 2024. She established contact, and then came the conversation that no investigator can fully prepare for, telling a 27-year-old woman that the life she believed she had lived, the identity she had always understood as her own, was built on a foundation that someone else had laid without her knowledge or consent. Andrea Michelle Reyes had been abducted before she was old enough to remember being abducted. She had grown up not knowing she was missing. The father who never stopped. When the New Haven Police Department shared the news with Andrea's father, his reaction was described as overwhelming. He had gone to Mexico himself. He had searched. He had continued for 25 years to believe that his daughter was alive somewhere, a belief that the world around him had increasingly found difficult to sustain, but one he had refused to abandon. The reunion between Andrea and her father happened in early 2024. It was private, as it should be. The details of how two people navigate a relationship separated by 25 years and an entire constructed identity belong to them, not to the public record. What the public record does contain is a statement released by the New Haven Police Department, which ended with these words: "No cold case is ever closed. We remain committed to resolving every cold case, and this is a perfect example of that effort." No cold case is ever closed. Detective Nivikoff had taken a case that was 24 years old and found a living person on the other side of it. She had given a father back the daughter who was taken from him before he had the chance to know her. And she had given a woman the truth about who she was, a truth she had never known she was missing, in a way that complicated and deepened and irrevocably changed everything she thought she understood about her own life. That kind of investigation doesn't make the news the way an escape from a house of horrors does. There's no dramatic 911 call, no neighbor kicking in a door, no radio transmission saying we found them. There's just a detective, a cold case file, modern investigative tools, and an unwillingness to accept that some questions don't deserve answers. The question isn't only how do you find someone who has been missing for years. Sometimes a harder question is, how do you find someone who doesn't know they are missing? Detective Nivikoff answered it. Here's what I want you to think about. Andrea was 23 months old when she was taken. She grew up with an entirely different identity in an entirely different country. Do you believe it is possible to fully rebuild a sense of self after that kind of revelation? And is there a version of this story where the reunion causes more disruption than healing for the person who was taken? There's no easy answer. Tell me how you see it in the comments. Story 4. What surviving means, and what we owe to the ones who waited. These 3 cases, Cleveland, California, Connecticut, span a combined total of more than 50 years of captivity, disappearance, and searching. They involve 3 very different kinds of abduction and 3 very different moments of discovery. But at their center, they share something that gets lost when the cameras arrive and the dramatic rescue narratives take over. They are stories about waiting. The families who wait. The investigators who keep the files. The survivors who endure. And the moment, after years of that waiting, when the world changes in a phone call or a background check or a detective's refusal to close a folder, the people who were left to wait. Luana Miller waited for Amanda Berry for 3 years before she died. She never got to know. She went to her grave not knowing whether the daughter she spent those years fighting for was alive or dead. That is the kind of grief that cannot be fully captured in a news story about a happy ending. The happy ending arrived too late for Luana. Carl Probin, Jaycee Dugard's stepfather, watched a grey car take his stepdaughter from a street where he was standing and could not catch up to it in time. He has spent decades carrying the weight of that proximity, of being there, of seeing it happen, of being unable to stop it. Gina De Jesus's parents spent 9 years attending vigils, maintaining hope, and, without knowing it, sometimes being in the same room as a man who had their daughter chained upstairs in a house 2 miles away. Michelle Knight's family, who assumed she had run away, never launched the kind of public search that Amanda Berry and Gina De Jesus received. Knight disappeared without the sustained urgency that might have found her sooner. She was an adult. She had a complicated background. The system made an assumption and moved on. Knight spent 11 years in that house, the longest of the 3 women. She knows what the absence of an adequate search costs. Andrea Reyes' father searched by himself, in a foreign country, with no resources and no institutional support, because no one else was going to go to Mexico and look through a city of 1 million people for a toddler who had been taken 25 years earlier. What the survivors built. Here is the part of this story that matters most, and the part that gets the least coverage in the immediate aftermath of a rescue. What these women did after. What they built. What they chose to do with a future that was returned to them when most of the world had decided the return was impossible. Amanda Berry became the host of a daily missing persons segment on a Cleveland television station called Missing with Amanda Berry. She uses her platform, and the name that was returned to her on May 6, 2013, to help find other people who are still missing. She became the face of survival in a way that serves not herself but others. Gina De Jesus founded the Cleveland Center for Missing, Abducted, and Exploited Children and Adults. She deliberately opened it on Seymour Avenue, the same street where she was held for 9 years. She took the street that represented the worst of what happened to her and turned it into the address of something built to help others. Michelle Knight, who received the least institutional attention when she disappeared and endured the longest captivity, has written 2 books about her experience and has spoken publicly about not letting darkness define a life. You can overcome all obstacles that stand in your way, she has said. Don't let the darkness control your light in your life. Jaycee Dugard created the Jaycee Foundation. She wrote 2 books. She raised her daughters, the same daughters whose existence in that backyard compound was once the reason she couldn't leave. Those daughters are now adults. They went to college. Andrea Reyes is navigating the ongoing, complicated, private process of integrating 2 identities into one life. She is doing it away from the cameras, which is exactly where she should be. None of these women owed the public any of this. Having survived what they survived, the only thing any of them owed was to themselves, to exist, to recover, to live in whatever way they could manage. The fact that several of them turned their survival into active advocacy for other missing people is not something anyone had the right to expect. It is something they chose. That choice deserves to be named directly and loudly because it represents something extraordinary about the human capacity to transform the worst possible experience into a force that points outward rather than inward. What the investigations tell us. Taken together, these cases are a manual for what breaks down in the systems designed to prevent long-term abductions and what eventually allows them to be resolved. In Cleveland, the failure was multidimensional. Michelle Knight was inadequately investigated as a missing person because she was an adult with a complicated background. Neighbor reports of suspicious activity were not followed up on. A man with a documented history of domestic violence and a house that was generating community concern was never subjected to the kind of scrutiny that might have saved 3 women years of captivity. In California, the failure of Philip Garrido's parole supervision has been documented extensively. A convicted sex offender, serving parole for kidnapping and rape, had his home visited 60 times without the parole officer ever looking past a fence into a backyard that contained a hidden compound and an abducted child. The system designed specifically to monitor dangerous offenders failed in the most direct and consequential way possible. In the Reyes case, the failure was systemic in a different direction. International abductions, particularly those that cross into countries with limited extradition cooperation or investigative resources, represent an enormous challenge for law enforcement. Cases fall through the cracks not from malice but from limitation, and they stay cold until someone decides to pick them back up. The resolutions in all three cases came from unexpected directions. A campus officer at UC Berkeley who ran a background check because something felt off. A detective in Connecticut who reopened a file and applied modern tools to a 24-year-old investigation. A woman in Cleveland who stood at a door on the warmest day of the year and decided that the risk of being wrong was worth it. None of those moments were the result of a massive institutional initiative. They were individual human beings doing what they were supposed to do, with the full weight of their training and their instincts behind them. One campus officer, one detective, one woman. That is how all three of these cases ended. Not with a dramatic sweep of resources or a technological breakthrough. With a person who paid attention when it mattered. Closing. Somewhere in the world right now, there are people who are missing. Not in places that make the news. Not in cases that receive sustained coverage. They are in houses and basements in foreign cities and places that the world has accepted they will never be found. Some of them won't be. That is the brutal truth of this subject, and it deserves to be said without softening. But some of them will. Because a parole officer will finally look behind the fence. Because a detective will reopen a folder. Because a campus officer will decide that something doesn't add up and run a check on a stranger. Because a woman will stand at a door and decide that today is a day. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children estimates that in the United States alone, a child goes missing every 40 seconds. At any given time, there are nearly 90,000 open missing persons cases. The majority of them are adults who are not given adequate resources and attention. The cases that receive the most coverage are, historically, those involving certain demographics, and the cases that fall through the cracks disproportionately involve people who look like Michelle Knight, not people who look like the faces on the most prominent missing persons billboards. That disparity has been documented. It has been named. The question is whether it has been changed. Amanda Berry spent a decade in a house 2 miles from where she disappeared. Jaycee Dugard spent 18 years in a backyard that was visited 60 times by a parole officer who never looked past a fence. Andrea Reyes spent 25 years not knowing that her entire identity had been constructed from an abduction she was too young to remember. 3 women, 3 rescues, 3 families who never stopped waiting, even when the world moved on. The final question I want you to carry into the comments is this. Of all the systemic failures in these 3 cases, inadequate investigation of adult missing persons, failed parole supervision, international abduction challenges, which do you believe is the most urgent to fix right now? And do you think the public and the media attention given to missing persons cases is distributed fairly? Tell me what you think. Share this with someone. And remember that behind every cold case file is a family that is still waiting, and behind every unexpected resolution is a human being who decided to look one more time. New episode coming. See you in the next one.